Okay, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar today. As I said, my name is Frances Griffin, and I'm going to be delivering your webinar this afternoon, which will hopefully last around 50 minutes. And then there'll be a question and answer session at the end. We are recording the webinar today, so I want to really start by saying think about looking after yourself. Some of you may have been in school already today, and or some of you may be working from home or both, potentially. So if you need to go and get yourself a drink or have something to eat, please go off and do that. And remember that I can't see you. You can see me, but you can switch me off if you like. But I can't see you. I'm just going to start by saying that these webinars are funded by Education Scotland with the stated intention of supporting the health of the workforce, really. So that's you people. And would really like to acknowledge that this is a very stressful time for everyone, and you as educators are really on the front line of this pandemic. So as I've said, the webinar will be recorded and you'll be able to access that at any time. So this means that some of the references might be to events or situations that have already happened if you're watching the recording. Within any of these webinars that we're facilitating, we might touch on sensitive areas that, for you personally. So just to be aware of that. So that's why we made a slide here. We made an emergency support slide really for your benefit, so that if you are feeling a wee bit fragile, you can contact any of the supports on this slide. And obviously we know that, I'll just move that up here. Obviously, we know that the first port of call is usually your GP. Now, you can use the chat box if you've got any questions, but as I say, we'll have questions and answers at the end. I might ask you to stop and reflect for a few moments throughout the webinar, so it might be useful for you to have a pen and a paper at your side. Okay. So you might want to take a snapshot or a screen grab, if that's the technology that we use, or a photo of this slide for reference. So today's session, what we're really going to cover today is thinking about anxiety. So to explore anxiety, so its purpose and its impact on us as individuals and on others. And to do that, we're going to look at and try and understand the neuroscience. So what's happening in our body? What's happening to us? What's happening in our brain when we experience anxiety? And also we're going to look at the psychological mechanisms of anxiety. So again, what happens in our body, what we think, what we feel, both emotions and physical sensations. Oh, I'll move that back a bit there. And how that makes us behave. And then we'll end the session by looking at healthy strategies, hopefully to manage anxiety. And we'll finish off with a kind of grounding exercise that you can participate in. So almost like a kind of on-the-spot meditation, if you like. But there's no pressure to join in with that at all. So when we're thinking about anxiety, we decided that we would use the Mind Mental Health Charity definition of anxiety. So anxiety is when we feel we're worried or tense or afraid, particularly about things that are about to happen in the future or we think that could happen. Anxiety is a natural human response when we perceive things to be under threat. It can be experienced through our thoughts, our feelings, and our physical sensations. Now, what Mind also state is that anxiety is considered problematic if the symptoms cause significant distress and impact on the individual's functioning in their daily life. They also state that when everyday anxiety becomes problematic, it's considered an anxiety disorder. So it's worthwhile thinking then, if you or someone you know is experiencing anxiety to a level that disrupts normal functioning, you or they should probably contact your GP or their GP or any of the organisations on the emergency support slide. So from what we've said, you can see that anxiety is really universal. It's a normal, healthy emotion that everyone experiences daily. It's an everyday emotion that's really essential for human life and functioning. And anxiety is an emotional response to real or perceived threat. And the sensation of anxiety is the same whether the threat is real or perceived or imagined, I should say. So our mind and body still have a panic reaction when threat is perceived. And really a phobia is a good example of this. And it can be difficult for non-sufferers to really understand. And we know that you can have phobias about anything at all, so buttons, heights, spiders, zebras, or in my case, clip shears or earwigs as they're commonly known. And you don't have to see the object to fear. You don't have to see the object that you fear to have an anxiety attack. So it's really important not to belittle phobias for this reason. So right now, me even thinking about clip shears, I can feel that kind of tightness here in my chest, and I can feel my breathing getting deeper. Yeah, you might have similar reactions there. But we also want to think about anxiety as being something that's useful for us, because we really need anxiety to motivate us to get up in the morning. So we need that certain level of cortisol, and that helps us stay interested in performing and achieving our goals. Our performance can be impaired by low levels and high levels of arousal. So if we're way too relaxed down here and not sufficiently motivated, we might actually be feeling quite anxious, and that stops us from actually getting to our peak performance. And our peak performance, as I said, can be impaired by low levels and high levels of arousal. Our peak performance is generally optimum when there's just enough pressure, but not too much for too long. And if you think about it, with the extreme pressure on schools, it's possible, maybe even likely, that many of you are on the downward slope, where the symptoms of anxiety are getting in the way of your performance. And you're maybe coming down this slope here. So when you're thinking about whether you have the time to do the things that will alleviate your anxiety, it's good to think about this slope, because if you get too far down the other side, your normal functioning could really be impacted to the point that you lose sight of your own competence and you might actually burn out. So the question to ask here really is, do you have the option not to invest in your well-being? And that's a question that I'd like you to consider as we go throughout the presentation, as we move throughout the presentation there. So the question is, do you have the option not to invest in your well-being? So the title of the webinar is around anxiety as a response to uncertainty. So anxiety, if we think about it this way, can really act as a defense mechanism against uncertainty. We normally experience anxiety about the things that are future-based, and certainly the uncertainty created by the pandemic inevitably produces a rise in anxiety. However, in truth, the experience of coping with not knowing and the uncertainty is part of our human condition, and it's been around long before the pandemic. I'll just move that back there a little bit. So exposure to consecutive or chronic stressors can result in increased levels of anxiety and depression. And I guess that's where we all are at the moment, with all the increased demands on us to do more. and to be there for everyone. So that's why we need to think about anxiety being individual to us all as well, because we'll all respond differently based on our experience. So as I said to you, it's quite useful to think about the neuroscience of anxiety, and we can do this by thinking that we have two brains. So we have our prefrontal cortex, which is often referred to as our thinking brain, and we can have the limbic brain, which is often referred to as our emotional brain. Now, the limbic system contains the amygdala, which is responsible for exclusively for our fight and flight mechanism. And the amygdala has no thinking function. It simply reacts to hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol released in the adrenal gland. Now, if we go back in time and think about early human beings, they had quite a large amygdala in relation to the rest of their brain, because survival was a daily factor in their lives, unlike it is for most of us today. Because they had hairy mammoths and saber-toothed tigers to contend with, this meant that their amygdala served as a life function, or as a life-saving function, I should say, in alerting them to threat. So in a split second, they might have to choose to fight off an assailant, run for their lives, or play dead perhaps. However, in modern times, we don't have the same constant threats to our lives. However, if you experience trauma or ACEs, especially in childhood, your amygdala may be especially reactive. At this stage in our evolution, the amygdala is triggered often throughout the day for some of us, and this is referred to the smoke alarm effect. So the body and the brain record a threat often, and when the threat is minimal, which we aren't allowing ourselves time to process and therefore re-regulate, we're left with high levels of stress hormones swirling around in our bloodstream, and sometimes our base level hormones remain too high, and just even small things can set off the cycle again. And you might actually recognise this in children, and you might see them easily triggered here. So up until about 200 years ago, in addition to far less bombardment with stimuli, people walked for many miles each day to and from the fields or to market days. And what this gave people was lots of time to process, so lots of time to think and feel about the events. And it also engaged their parasympathetic nervous system to flush out any stress hormones. So they were much more likely to be regulated. And if you think about that today, for those of us who are working from home, we don't even have that travel to and from, the travel in the car, or even with our busy lives, even if we do have travel in the car, we might be thinking about the next thing that we have to do, and not taking that time to process and think about and feel about the day. But going back to long ago, the exercise really helped them to recover and aided their prefrontal cortex and their amygdala to get back in sync. Because what we know is both our prefrontal cortex and our limbic brain need to be working in sync to re-engage each other to help us with thinking and reasoning. So we're moving on to how anxiety is there to keep us safe. So put simply, anxiety alerts our brains to the possibility of risk or threat, whether that risk is physical or psychological. That's really its purpose. This makes us nervous before an exam or before a job interview. And our nerves can really help us focus our attention exclusively on the issue before us. We can take protective factors such as maybe studying, preparing, resting, getting support, or indeed running away from the danger, whatever works for us. If we have a history of risk or trauma, our brains may be wired to sense danger even when there is no threat present. We may have grown an extra sensitive perceptual antennae which pick up noise and imagine it to be something scary. This means that we can really overgeneralize and switch to anxiety mode because we have a sense of something undefinable out there. But actually, what's happened is we've generated it from within. So letting go of anxious responses can leave us feeling quite unprotected. And like all behaviours, if we're practicing this kind of high alert often, even if it's out of our awareness, we get really good at it. And we actually have to consciously practice letting go. That takes a bit of work. During the time of heightened anxiety, when there's a very real unseen danger in the field of our experience, like we have now during this pandemic, you may find you've got really good at perceiving threats, even when there aren't any immediate dangers, and any new thing or movement might be registered as a threat. So we become good at that, you know. We find that we're really good at perceiving threats, even when we're not in any immediate danger, or any new movement might be registered as a threat. And we'll come to what we can put in place to try and reteach our brain different responses in a little while. So we've said already that anxiety is individual. Our perception is guided by what we have learned so far of the world. Yeah? Generally speaking, our perception of the world around us can be more important than determine how we feel than the nature of the world itself. There are, of course, obvious exceptions to this. So, for example, being exposed to war, or as we are currently in the middle of a pandemic. So, if we feel the world to be a dangerous place, that is more likely to inform our feelings than whether the world is objectively dangerous. So the way in which we process information from the world around us, i.e. the situations and events that occur, is key in determining how we react to that world. So in other words, the way in which you think about things, your cognitions, can influence the way in which you feel, your emotions and your physical feelings and sensations, and then what you do as a consequence, so your behaviour. So they're all connected there. And while there are currently field conditions which are exacerbating the experience of anxiety for many, it is still true that our psychological history, what we bring to our experience, shapes our individual experience of the pandemic and anxiety. So having looked at individual experiences of anxiety, next we'll spend a short time thinking about how we can share our feelings with others. So our feeling state, how we share this with others, and in doing so can invite them to join in with us, so they can join in our anxiety as well. And that's because anxiety is contagious. The spread of emotion from one person to another is called social contagion. Our own anxiety can be cued or triggered simply by talking to someone else who's anxious. And I'm sure we've all probably experienced that. And that's because human beings are social creatures. As we discussed, we have a perceptual antennae that pick up information about the world. Just like Spider-Man here. However, unlike Spider-Man, our spidey sense is not always as finely tuned, and we can interpret any disturbance to our antennae as anxiety inducing. Also, unlike Spider-Man, there are a lot of us humans, and when one of us feels a tingling, we can pass that on to others before really checking with ourselves whether we really need to be raising that alarm. So how can you break the cycle in the chain and regulate yourself so that you aren't passing the alarm on to others? To be the one to stop the social contagion, we need to be able to recognise the signs of our own anxiety. We need to manage our own anxiety first before supporting others. And that's an oxygen mask principle, where you need to put your own oxygen mask on before you can put anyone else's on. So some of our symptoms of anxiety happen out of our own awareness, and others around us might actually be picking up with their spidey sense. We all know that feeling of being on eggshells around someone else. That is often their transmission of their fears that you're picking up, but they actually don't know they're doing it. So get to know your individual experience, and you'll know what's yours and you'll know what's theirs. So it's important for us to consider our experience of anxiety throughout our body. And I guess anxiety or the experience of anxiety is a good demonstration of how joined up our nervous system is. So if we're tuned to our sensations, we can feel it as a whole body experience where everything gets involved. And this is because the body often alerts us to anxiety before the thoughts form. So we might actually experience a racing heart, we might have palpitations, sweating, flushing or redness, restlessness, butterflies in our stomach, a compressed feeling in our chest, or other symptoms. The list goes on. If we don't pay attention to the information our body is giving us, we can remain in a state of something isn't just quite right. And by that, we perpetuate our own anxiety and those around us. And we need to be aware because this can have such a cumulative effect on us. You might actually be someone who stops breathing fully when you're anxious. This can lead to tension in your shoulders, exacerbated by jaw clenching at night, which then leads to headaches, all of which have a longer term impact on our body. And if you've ever experienced a panic attack, you may have all these sensations at once. But one of the useful things about anxiety is that sometimes, but not always, once we notice symptoms and relate them to feeling anxious, we can really interrupt its progress by slowing down and paying attention to the symptoms, whether they're emotional, physical, or behavioural ones. And by paying attention to these, you could consider that this is a means of grounding ourselves. And we're going to run through the grounding exercise, or one option of grounding, in a moment, and then come back to some more in a few more slides. But I just wondered there, thinking about noticing anxiety in ourselves and in children. What do we notice? Some examples are difficulties in concentrating. We see that in children and ourselves. Poor sleep, bad dreams, changes to our eating pattern, constantly worrying, having negative thoughts, frequently checking ourselves or checking other things, being tense or fidgety, or having to use the toilet more often, frequent crying or clinginess and neediness, complaining of tummy, headaches, or feeling unwell, and wanting to avoid certain people, places, or things. That's my go-to. Being irritable or quick to anger, challenging behaviour. So these are all the things that can help us notice anxiety when we're feeling anxious. Now, this really kind of summarizes, this slide here really summarizes what we've been talking about, and it's called the Hot Cross Buns. It's a cognitive behavioural approach which highlights the link between how we think, how we feel, both emotionally and physically, and how we behave in response to our thoughts and feelings. These factors, our thoughts, emotions, physical feelings, and behaviours, influence each other and are individual to us, stemming from the way in which we perceive the world. So this is, as I said, a cognitive behavioural model, a CBT model, and it highlights the impact of a situation by examining our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviour, and our physical sensation. It's known as the 5-area model, or more commonly known in the UK as a hot cross buns, and the term was first coined by Christine Pavlovsky. So the hot cross bun model demonstrates 4 main features present when we experience anxiety. It does require us to sit down and spend a short time reflecting, and I'm going to talk you through it, but it is something that you might want to come back to when you look at the, if you want to look at the webinar later. And it's an exercise that I would really encourage you to use with young people. It's a very good exercise for getting them to identify their experience of anxiety. So I'll talk you through it. So the first thing that you would do is you would take a piece of paper and draw a cross to split it into 4 sections. And then you'd be inviting yourself or others to think about or consider something that causes mild anxiety. Nothing too overwhelming, just something that causes mild anxiety. And then, when you're anxious, you think about what are the thoughts that start to arise. And it might be that you have worried or fretful thoughts, like, oh, I can't do it. What if this happens? Oh, I won't be good enough. And you'd write all your thoughts down in that section. And then you'd consider, what are the feelings that are coming up? Maybe feelings of not being competent, defeated, frustrated, and you write them in the feelings section. And what physiological responses do you notice? Shallow breathing, clenching your jaw, raised heartbeat, and you note them down. And then what behaviours come to play? Do you start lots of different tasks but don't finish any? Do you respond to people with frustration? So you're beginning to think, how are you? And how is this impacting your perception of the world? Understanding how anxiety shows up for us helps us to know when we need to be making a change. Even a small change to breathe or to walk away from our desks for a few moments can actually make a difference. As I said, we all behave individually when we're anxious, so I might busy myself with work or cleaning or distract myself. Others might become distracted and forgetful, drop things or have accidents. What do you do? Do your behaviours support you to calm down, or do they feed into the experience of being anxious? These are good questions to ask yourself and to ask others. So rest and recovery. If there's one key message that we'd like you to take away from this webinar, it is about how you manage your rest and recovery. So if we're going back to the nervous system, it's important to remember that flushing out the stress hormones by finding ways to rest and recover is essential to keeping anxiety motivating and not overwhelming. So by catching your thoughts and challenging whether they're catastrophic, as they might seem, or taking time to regulate your heartbeat and breathing can actually give you space to ensure enough rest to recover your equilibrium. However, if you're going back to that place of, oh, there's too much to do and I don't have enough time to recover or to rest and recover, once again, you really need to ask yourself that important question. Can I afford not to find the time? And that's not just for your sake or for yourself, but it's also for those around you. The uncertainty of the current climate is making everything feel urgent, and schools really are feeling the brunt of that. And our lack of control over the things which we're used to having control over leaves a gap in our lives which we can easily project our own anxiety into. So coming back to what we can do that will be good enough can help us reset our expectations of ourselves. So it's thinking about what is good enough and coming back to that all the time rather than responding to all the demands and thinking that we need to meet all those demands. So we're looking at healthy strategies to manage anxiety. So I need to take a wee drink here. My tongue's getting dry. So we've already mentioned the hot cross buns exercise, and we've listed some others here. And it really is a common misconception that there's nothing to be done about our anxiety. It just needs to be suffered. Actually, there are things that you can do to support yourself and to reground and review what the actual level of risk is in the present. And many of these activities can be done in 5 minutes if you're practiced at them. And it might be that not all of them will work for you, okay? Or that you need to be so alert, or that your need, I should say, to be so alert overrides your initial attempts to calm the anxious feelings. If the first thing you try doesn't work, then try it again or try something different. If you consider developing your resistance to anxiety like developing a new skill, why would you expect to be good at it the very first time you try it? Like any new skill, it needs to be practiced. New neural pathways need to be developed, and thinking about it isn't really the same as actually doing it. I think we all know that. Regulating the nervous system can really be a balm, can really be soothing for anxiety, and it's something we can do for ourselves. Consider learning how to self-regulate is like doing the couch 5K for your mental health. The first day you might only get as far as putting 2 feet on the ground. By day 5 you might be getting both feet on the ground, and you might be taking 3 deep breaths before that anxiety kicks in again. But that's actually okay. By day 30 it may take only 5 deep breaths for you to get back to the present moment. So it helps to pay attention to what makes you feel better, but also to what makes you feel worse, so that you can accurately attribute it. And then we've got distractions, and I just really wanted to pull out distractions here because most of us try to address our anxiety by distracting ourselves. Now, this doesn't really normally work in the long term, but distracting yourself can work as part of a strategy. So, for example, you might distract yourself with a game on your phone before you have an exam to support your waiting. But as a standalone strategy, it just will not work, it will not be successful. And just to give you an example of that, a couple of weeks ago, I was hugely anxious, lots of things going on in my mind and head, and I just needed to stop thinking. So my husband went out to work in the morning, and when he came home in the afternoon, I had completely papered the fireplace wall. Now that was a distraction for me that helped me in the short term. Obviously, every day I went out to work, I couldn't come home and I'd have the wallpaper. but it provided me with a distraction in the moment to give me space not to think, if that makes sense. So we all have our ways to distract ourselves, but remember you need to get to the underlying issue. Okay. So supporting each other and children and young people with anxiety, and we can think about anxiety as stress and tension as well. They're all kind of interchangeable here. Um, what's really important is to normalise the feelings of anxiety. So it's okay, and we're actually not very good at doing that because there's often a lot of shame around admitting that we're feeling anxious or that we're stressed or that we seem to be not coping. We tend not to actually um, talk about that or normalise it for ourselves or others. We need to model looking after our own mental health, and again, that can be easier said than done. But we can try and prioritise our own regulation. So remember that social contagion. How quickly we can pass on or others can pass on their anxiety to us and vice versa. So prioritise access or your access to exercise, sleep, healthy eating, co-regulation. And we all know about co-regulation in relation to children. We know that children need adults to help them regulate physically and emotionally. And we do that by listening, talking, and empathising and comforting them. But we as adults also need that. We need co regulation. We need to be listened to. We need someone to talk to. We need to feel that empathy and we need comforting. So adults also need to be around grounded adults in order to regulate. And then, as Mark Twain said, I've lived through some terrible things in my life, some of which actually happened. As we said earlier, anxiety can be an exercise in worrying about things that are yet to happen. One of the ways of grounding is to spend a little time coming back to the present moment and remind ourselves that none of these things have actually happened yet, and they may still not. So that's why we're going to introduce you to a grounding exercise. Now, again, this is something that you might want to come back to, um, but I am going to tell you about this exercise and just take you through it. And sometimes doing an exercise like this can really release feelings that you're not really aware of having. So if you aren't in a private space, then you might want to move into one, or you might want to return to the webinar when you can let yourself have a moment. So I'm going to start by asking you to notice how you're feeling at present. On a scale of 1 to 10, what is your level of anxiety at the moment? Is there any urgent internal chatter? I must do this, I must do that, I mustn't forget this. Is that going on in your head at the moment? And consider, how is your heart rate? What about your muscle tension? Are you feeling tense? And what is your mood like? Perhaps you're only half listening, also reading emails, marking work, planning lessons, thinking about the tea. So you might want to give yourself time to stop and give yourself permission for this moment. So if you aren't already, I'd ask you to sit on a chair. Put both feet on the floor. Just put both of your feet on the floor there. And notice the weight of your feet on the floor. Let them actually rest in your shoes or in your slippers. Start to push against the floor gently, noticing what that does to your calves, your shins, and your thighs. Really push and feel the tension, noticing how far up the body it rises. Now relax your feet again. Feel yourself sitting in your chair. Notice the backs of your legs on the seat. How does that feel? Are you letting the chair hold you, or are you doing most of the work yourself? Notice your breathing. Feel the rise and fall of your stomach as you allow the chair to hold you. Notice your shoulders falling as you allow the long out breath. Let yourself enjoy 2 or 3 breaths if that feels good. Now look around you. What's on the walls? Is there a picture you can see? Books on the shelf? Books on the floor? And look at something without needing to change it and start to describe it to yourself. So it might be, oh, I see my extension lead. It's got 3 plugs in it. They look a bit like tadpoles. The light's on the extension. It's next to the wall where there's a picture of my family. The picture's in a black frame, and so on and so on. Describe what you can see to yourself. Then say to yourself internally, in this moment, right now, I'm okay. In this moment, right now, I'm okay. You don't actually have to believe this to say it. So any thoughts or questions here? I've got one question up here. So the question here are, what would be the best response to be someone who says this? You are clumsy and forgetful these days. What would be the best way to respond to this to someone who does not understand your anxiety or sees you answer it? So I guess it's thinking about how might you respond to that? So I'm just thinking here, why are you so clumsy and forgetful these days? So I wonder, like my therapist's head is saying to me that I might respond by saying, oh, it feels like you're feeling a little bit frustrated with me right now, in a response to that. It's not necessarily a defensive response, but it is a response that acknowledges perhaps how they're feeling. Or it could be something simple as, oh, you're noticing all the things that I'm doing right now. So just really returning what you're saying back to them.
Hi, Francis.
Hi there. So
I've got one comment. Can you say dreams and nightmares are as a result of anxiety?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Can we say that dreams and nightmares are as a result of anxiety?
Well, sometimes they are, sometimes they're not necessarily connected to that. I think that if you are aware of what you're dreaming about, if you're recognizing that you're anxious, then you may make the connection that you're dreaming more, or that you're awake more at nights as well. So they can and they can't be, I guess.
Great. Got another question from Mariam. What's the best way to respond to highly anxious people that you have to be with? For example, both my parents are highly anxious. I'm in my 50s and they're in their 80s.
Again, it's when you're around really anxious people, it tends to make you anxious. And sometimes it's simply saying, oh, I'm suddenly feeling really anxious right now, and I'm wondering if that's how you're feeling. So sometimes it's simply giving a response like that. And other times it's really acknowledging their anxiety. So acknowledging how they're feeling, saying, oh, it feels like you're really anxious. And I'm wondering what would be helpful at this time. So then you're acknowledging their anxiety, but you're also responding to them empathically and asking if there's anything that you can do to help.
Thank you. Another question. How do I stop relying on old unhelpful coping strategies? For example, overeating.
For example,
Overeating.
so I think the unhelpful coping strategies, the first thing you need to do is what you've done is recognize that you have an unhelpful coping strategy. And then you have to, actively practice changing that strategy. So, if you remind me what you said the unhelpful strategy was, I'm just having a wee bit difficulty hearing. So,
Oh, sorry about that. I think it's my microphone. The unhelpful coping strategy, for example, overeating.
overeating. Mm-hmm. So that's your unhelpful coping strategy is overeating. So it's really being aware of that, and that you're doing that, and every time it's basic kind of CBT approach that you want to adopt there. So if you're overeating, it's recognizing and saying, this is not something that's helpful to me, having notes on your fridge, that kind of thing, everything in moderation. So it's really about being aware that you're doing that and then putting in other things in place to not just distract you in the moment, but to provide you with an alternative. So if you're overeating, is there something that you can do instead of overeating? Can you get up and walk out of the kitchen? Can you, just really simple things that we tend not to think about, and find something else that might be helpful.
Another question. Where is the best place to start when dealing with overwhelming feelings that you may be bringing on yourself by viewing everything as a big problem?
Well, again, I think that, when you do something like the hot cross buns exercise, that's a good place to start, because then you're beginning to identify out what the feelings are, what the thoughts are, and what your behaviours are. And it might just need to be that you need to change one. They're all interlinked. So it might need to be that you change a thought, or it might be that you change a behaviour, just a small thing. And then they're all interconnected. So you move around that by changing one thing, it can have an effect on the other. So I would encourage you to do those kind of exercises.
Another question. How would you react to your boss who dismisses your mental health issues, depression, and anxiety, by saying that everyone has struggles and that I need to realize that?
So at the start of the question, can you say that again? Can you read it again?
How do you react to your boss who dismisses your mental health issues, depression, and anxiety, by saying that everyone has struggles and that I need to realize that?
That is a tricky one, isn't it? Because, you know, it is about how do you respond in that moment in time without becoming defensive in relation to your boss. But it is about, I'm glad you recognise that everyone has anxiety. And, you know, and perhaps we could take some time to think about that and how that impacts on you and how that impacts on the whole school community. So it's kind of really putting it back to them, you know. That's great that you recognise that everyone has anxiety, and let's stop and think about what we can do about that and how we can stop that chain. And going back to, you know, there are things that we can do about anxiety. So I know everyone has anxiety, but there are things that we can put in place, and perhaps there are things within the school environment that we can change, and could we have a discussion about that? I don't know if that's helpful or not.
That leads on quite well to our next question. Do you have any strategies for removing controlling, repetitive, negative take up your headspace? A method for controlling this would be very useful.
Do we have any spreadsheets?
Any strategies?
Oh, sorry, any.
Sorry. Do you have any strategies for removing controlling or repetitive negative thoughts take up your headspace?
Well, like, again, it is about that self-talk, isn't it? So it's about, you know, engaging in positive self-talk, I can do instead of I can't do. So it's about practicing those strategies because, you know, like I said, you know, sometimes we're so overwhelmed and we're so caught up and alert to what we need to be doing that none of these strategies really work for us in the beginning. So we have to go back and practice them all the time. You know, and mindfulness is a really good way of doing that. It can really bring you back into the present moment, and then focus on, it goes back to thinking about what can I focus on now that actually is manageable and I can do well. So it's looking at the things that you can do and you can do well and good enough, as opposed to looking at the things that you can't do or the negative thoughts that come into your mind.
We've received some thank yous for your responses. So here's another question. I'd like to ask about any strategies for when dealing with the situation of working in an environment which is characterized mostly anxiety. For example, most of the conversations are negative and a stressful trigger.
So you're in an environment where everything is negative, and then that triggers your anxiety, and then it goes round in that vicious circle. So again, it's like how do you break that chain, and respond more positively so that you don't get caught up in that kind of emotional or social contagion of negativity. And it's really hard to do that because it goes around like a ping pong ball, and somebody passes it from you, you know, and you pass it to someone else, and before you know it, you're caught up in that. And that's why it's good to kind of take a step back from the situation before responding immediately. And again, reviewing it using some of the kind of strategies to write down and think, well, what's happening here? Does this belong to me? Is this about me? So taking stock of yourself and thinking, how am I feeling right now? When I came into this situation, I was actually feeling okay, and now suddenly I'm feeling quite overwhelmed. So that actually doesn't belong to me. So that's been projected onto me. So it's saying things like, when I first arrived, I was actually feeling okay, and I wonder what's changed in this situation to make me feel like this. And it's kind of been brave enough to say out and talk out some of what you're actually feeling, um, and see what kind of response you get, and open it up to others.
We've got quite a few interesting questions coming through. So I'll start off with this one. How best to support someone with OCD in the pandemic while waiting for the NHS CBT? Strategies or things to avoid? How not to become the coping mechanism myself?
I think, we all want to support children and young people with specific challenges, and OCD is something that is around for many children. And it's also about knowing our limitations and thinking that what can we realistically do to support that person? What have we already put in place for that person? And knowing where our kind of boundaries lie in relation to what else we can do. And sometimes it's just acknowledging the fact that that person has OCD and that they're really struggling with things, and asking them what they would like us to consider, as opposed to trying to come up with solutions and strategies for that person. So again, it goes back to the really acknowledging what the challenge and difficulty is for that person, and then asking them how they would like to be supported, and then looking at, well, are we already doing this, or what's working and what isn't working already, and is this beyond my capacity, and do I need to seek support from someone else in order to support that person?
There's a question about that says, if anxiety is a social contagion, as an employer, how do I balance their need to talk without getting anxiety throughout the team?
Right, can you read it out again? So if anxiety is a social contagion, as an employer,
As an employer, how do I balance their need to talk without getting anxiety throughout the team?
how do I balance their need without getting?
How do you balance their need to talk without getting anxiety throughout the team?
Okay, I think I've heard it all. I'm not sure if I'm hearing it all correctly, but I think you're saying, how do I balance their need without getting? I didn't quite catch that last bit. But I guess if anxiety is a social contagion, it simply goes back to that whole thing of, I know I keep saying it, but really acknowledging that, and acknowledging what's happening when you're with people who make you anxious, or if you're in a meeting and suddenly people are becoming anxious. So what is the anxiety? So really talking out loud. So we're all feeling a little bit anxious here, because we're not sure how things are, or we've not experienced this before. I'm just kind of hypothesizing here. We've not experienced things this before, and it's quite unknown to us. So inevitably we feel anxious. Some of us will feel more anxious than others. But what I do notice is that if we don't look at all the things, all the pros and cons in relation to this, then the anxiety is going to be passed around. I'm not sure if I'm really answering the question, but I think it is about really acknowledging that, and thinking about, what can I do to stop this? What can I be the break in the chain? Is it me that's causing the anxiety? Do I need to be very clear in relation to the demands that I'm asking or making? If I'm the employer, how do I be very concrete in your responses, and very factual, I guess, in your responses, in order to break that chain and ask people understand what's happening?
I think that answered the question. I think this final question looks like it's quite relevant to a lot of us in the situation we are in now. Do you have any advice for switching off from work and the anxieties our work life can bring so we can live a full life.
Yeah, I think that really is about looking at the boundaries that we have in place, so that we're not available 24/7, because I think in this pandemic, certainly from my experience of talking to school staff, is that they feel the need to be available, they feel the pressure to be available, and potentially from parents and demands that are made on them in order for them to do their job. But also they feel a need to help to support others. So it's actually about boundaries and how this very simple things in relation to switching off. If you've got an app on your phone, does it need to be on your phone? Can it be on a laptop so that it's not pinging 24/7 in the evening? And being very clear about different times of the day. So having structure within your day in the same way that you would create structure and routine for children, that you would want to create that for yourself. And then all the things that we said about using strategies that work for you, whether that's music, whether that's talking to others, finding out what works for you and protecting your time. It really is about protecting that time so that you have downtime. And because we will continue to be on and available to everyone 24/7 if we don't. So it's being able also to say no, which is really hard for us to say no, because then we feel that we might be judged in relation to our competence and what we're doing. So, it's a real balancing act, but I would really encourage you to find protected time in order to switch off, engage in whether it's Pilates, mindfulness, whatever works for you, in order to get that kind of equilibrium back and feel more settled and regulated in your body.
Thank you very much, Frances. We haven't got any more questions. So it looks like I think we're going to come to the end.